It's the start of week 3 in fantasy football, and we have guys like Puka Nacua, Nico Collins, and Josh Reynolds inside the top 10 overall scorers at the wide receiver position. Is that what this year's gonna be like? What is going on, Headliner Nation? That's right, it's week 3 of fantasy football, and today we're talking about all the wide receivers we're going to start and sit in all the matchups here this week, and it's been pretty crazy to start the season, but I feel like we say that every year. I don't know why we all don't kind of remember how crazy the start of the NFL season is each and every year. It's still way too early to panic, there's a lot of underachieving studs, and there's a lot of guys that are probably going to fade off into the sunset as the season continues. Now, before we get into every player, every matchup, every game, a quick word from today's sponsor.
Hey Headliner Nation, it's Taylor back again, and I want to talk to you about our sponsor for today's video, Marine Layer, but something's changed. After a good amount of washes of this denim shirt and this Marine Layer t-shirt, what hasn't changed is the softness and the quality. But what has changed is the exclusive limited time discount code for Headliner Nation. Use code FANTASY15 at checkout at marinelayer.com for 15% off your entire order. This t-shirt has become one of my favorites, and I wear it all the time. I get it, you may be thinking I've got plenty of old t-shirts in the closet that are pretty comfortable. But, you know, those holes in them and the wing stain, not so great. So I want to tell you about Marine Layer's Respun program. It's this super cool thing where they'll send you a t-shirt recycling kit that's prepaid, and you can send in all of those old t-shirts to get $5 per t-shirt credit at marinelayer.com. They'll literally pay you to send in those old t-shirts and turn them into new ones. We can agree that the perfect t-shirt is pretty hard to find, but Marine Layer has us covered. And for a limited time only, don't forget that discount code FANTASY15 at checkout for 15% off your entire purchase at marinelayer.com. Once again, that code is FANTASY15, 15% off your purchase at marinelayer.com. They're saving your closet one t-shirt at a time.
All right, but here we go. It's time to talk some football in week 3 at the wide receiver position. Hit the like button if you like all the timestamps down below in the description. Let's kick it off Thursday Night Football with the New York Giants and San Francisco 49ers. And if you just so happen to be looking for 16 wide receivers that score sub 7 fantasy points per contest, let me tell you about the New York Football Giants. They're overflowing with solid wide receivers, but none of them get consistent enough targets to give you any confidence in starting in fantasy football. Now, with the injury to Saquon Barkley, do we see more throwing in this offense going forward? Potentially, for sure. But in this matchup, on a Thursday night and a short week in San Francisco, I'm not drooling over any of these wide receivers when we're talking about going up against this San Francisco defense. But I will say this, the season is still young, but San Francisco has struggled to stop the pass more so than the run here to start the year. But that still doesn't change anything for me. Really, in this game, I'm doing one thing when it comes to the pass catchers of the New York Giants. I'm watching Jalin Hyatt. This is the only guy I may be interested in rest of season. He's going to start developing a little bit bigger of a role as the season goes on, and once he actually starts to get consistent volume, that may be the guy that we can go after when we're talking fantasy football wide receivers in New York. As of right now, though, no one you can really trust week to week. Now, it's kind of a different story when it comes to the wide receivers in San Francisco. It's still early in the season, but both Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk are showing promise that they can continue to coexist in this offense once again. I know last week Brandon Ayuk didn't have a huge game, but there were a few balls that just barely missed his outstretched fingertips that could have given him that big day. The volume is going to be there, though, so that doesn't worry me. What worries me a little bit, the bigger issue, was the shoulder injury that he suffered in week 2. Kyle Shanahan has already come out and said he's going to be a game time decision due to this game being on Thursday, and that is not ideal. He's going to have to be somebody we pay close attention to as we lead up to kickoff of this game, because now all of a sudden he's going to be a much higher of a risk than Deebo Samuel. Now on paper, it looks like the Giants are pretty good against the pass, allowing the 9th fewest passing yards per game so far this season. But you really need to remember, they did that in week 1 in a heavy downpour, a game in which the defense of Dallas absolutely dominated and Dak didn't have to throw very much. And then last week against the Arizona Cardinals, who are, yes, still the Arizona Cardinals. Having 2 matchups like that are going to make those numbers look a little bit better than maybe they should be. This is going to be a much tougher task for them this week going up against San Francisco. As of right now, I have no issue starting Deebo Samuel. Brandon Ayuk, we're crossing our fingers, we're crossing our toes. We would love to see him healthy and out there on Thursday Night Football, but right now, he may not play. But what do you say we mosey on over to Sunday football and go over to Baltimore for the Colts and the Ravens? Now, for Indianapolis, it's really just Michael Pittman, the only receiver getting enough volume to consider starting for the Colts. He has 23 targets and 16 receptions over the first 2 games of the season, and no one else is really even close to him in this offense. The biggest thing to watch here really is the availability of Anthony Richardson, who's currently in the concussion protocol. Does he play this week? If he can't, you better believe there's some Minshew mania in Indianapolis. And honestly, I really don't hate that for Michael Pittman either. He's still going to get peppered with targets. Now, Baltimore, they've allowed 37 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers on the year, and they're a little bit more difficult to run on than they are to throw on. I'm chasing the volume in this one. We always say to start wide receivers that average at least 10 targets a week. Well, that's Michael Pittman right now. As for Baltimore, the only wide receiver I'm looking at here has got to be Zay Flowers. Now, he did lose a few of his looks with the return of Mark Andrews in week 2, kind of like everyone expected, right? Mark Andrews still the binky of Lamar Jackson. But I think it's obvious right now that Zay Flowers is the number 1 wide receiver in this offense. Odell Beckham already banged up and hanging out with Kim Kardashian. Rashad Bateman getting nothing but short check down passes. Meanwhile, Flowers is averaging 6 catches for 70 yards a game and playing over 80% of the snaps. Indianapolis just gave up a huge day last week, almost 400 yards to CJ Stroud in the Texans in week 2. I'm looking for a little bit of that to go the way of Zay Flowers this week, and he's the only guy I'm looking at in Baltimore. Now we're going to head up to Cleveland for the Titans and the Browns, and in case you're wondering, no, I haven't gotten over the Nick Chubb injury yet. I'm trying, okay? I'm doing my best. But what that could really lead to in this offense is maybe a slight uptick in passing volume in Cleveland. Now, obviously, at the time this is being recorded, it's expected that Kareem Hunt is going to sign with the Cleveland Browns. That's okay. He can catch passes out of the backfield as well. Now, we know Amari Cooper, he's not 100% healthy. And when it comes to Elijah Moore, despite getting 16 targets in his first 2 games of the season, he's only brought in 6 of them. This matchup this week, though, will be way better for this offense in Cleveland. Going up against the Tennessee secondary will be nothing like going up against that defense in Pittsburgh. Tennessee allows over 42 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers and the 5th most passing yards per game in the NFL. Meanwhile, they're really tough to run on. Really hard to run on the Tennessee Titans, so a lot of teams will throw all over them. Really, the only risk when it comes to Amari Cooper then is going to be his health. But he played on Monday night, so as long as he didn't suffer any setbacks, I expect him to be out there in week 3 in a better matchup. We're going to start Amari Cooper there. Now, for Tennessee, you have the dink and dunk to DeAndre Hopkins, who is already banged up himself, and then you have the once-in-a-blue-moon deep shot to Treylon Burks, neither of which I love here in week 3. The Cleveland defense is actually pretty good, and they rank top 3 in all major defensive categories, allowing only 16 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Ryan Tannehill on the road in Cleveland against a top defense in the NFL, it just doesn't sound appealing. Now, D-Hop may be okay in maybe PPR scoring formats, but if he doesn't score a touchdown, more than likely he's going to hurt your fantasy team and hurt your chances at winning. We'll monitor his injury status here throughout the week, but right now, he's in a fight just to stay inside my top 30 wide receiver rankings. Which will then take us up to Detroit for the Lions and the Falcons, and I can see a lot of people starting to come back onto the Drake London bandwagon. The hard part to accept right now is the leading receiver in Atlanta is Mac Hollins, not Drake London. Even Bijan Robinson has racked up more receiving yards than Drake London has. But this is the matchup that London has a chance to really excel in. Detroit allows over 31 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and we know this Detroit offense finds ways to score, which is going to force Desmond Ridder to have to throw the ball all 4 quarters. Given the fact that we haven't seen any consistency in the Atlanta passing game since Ridder took over, it's really hard hard to trust anybody there. London will get the slight nod for me this week, but I do not expect him to be very high in my rankings due to the lack of consistency and risk for Detroit. As for hashtag Doomtar, Amon-Ra out there for everybody who's new, I think we all know that he should be started on a weekly basis here by now. But what about Josh Reynolds? He has really proven to be a viable option in this offense now in back-to-back weeks. With so much attention going the way of Amon-Ra, it's leaving Josh Reynolds with more quality looks. Then we add on top of that David Montgomery has suffered an injury, and we could be looking at even more passing volume in this offense. Now, Reynolds isn't some must-start guy just yet. Maybe in deeper leagues, 3 wide receiver leagues, he's worth a look. But he's definitely been a pleasant surprise here to start the 2023 season. But then we take a slight jog over to Green Bay for the Packers and the Saints. It's basically like Team Deep Balls of New Orleans against Team Blue Balls of Green Bay. You know, because Green Bay's hurting right now. Never mind. Bad joke. But anyway, let's start off with Chris Olave, who is going to be the best wide receiver playing in this game. Now, in week 2, he and Carr kind of struggled to connect a few times. The timing was just a little bit off between them. But he is still the clear leader in targets and receiving yards on this team, so I'm not overly worried about it. Meanwhile, Michael Thomas just running them slants. Great slants, Michael. Great slants. And then he's also trying to fight defensive linemen in the tunnels after games. Then you also have Rashid Shaheed, who's averaging almost 17 yards per reception, but just doesn't get a whole lot of volume. If you play in full PPR, I don't hate Michael Thomas this week. He's seen almost 9 targets a game, but Rashid Shaheed, he's only getting right around 5 or so per week, which really isn't enough. He's a little bit too boom or bust reliant on that big play and a touchdown. But really, Chris Olave is the main guy here, right? I think we all know that, but don't be surprised if this isn't a huge ceiling week for him either. Got Jair Alexander opposite of him, and he could take away some of that upside. What about for Green Bay? We're still awaiting the return of Christian Watson, and it's clear that Romeo Doubs still isn't 100%. He only played 38 offensive snaps in week 2 and had only 3 targets. Until we can see Doubs kind of return to a full workload, I think it's best we just stash him on our bench and wait. If he goes off at some point on your bench, cool. Don't worry about it. At least we know at that point he's healthy enough to start considering again. So really, until we hear about Christian Watson, it's the Jayden Reed show in Green Bay, but he is just so touchdown dependent right now. The 2 touchdowns he had in week 2 were great, but the 4 catches for 37 yards isn't. If he doesn't get those touchdowns, we don't even mention his name today in this show. And like we've said multiple times already, in just 2 weeks of the season, you can't go into weekly matchups just expecting touchdowns every single week. Now he's going to get a test against the Saints defense. But honestly, the Saints really haven't been tested much this year through the air. They've had to deal with Ryan Tannehill and Bryce Young. Neither one of those guys exactly lighting up the box scores. Now, I don't love Jayden Reed, but he will be a Verge top 30 wide receiver for me here in week 3, which will then take us down to Jacksonville for the Jaguars and the Houston Texans. And who would have thought that the Houston offense would be such a high volume passing offense with CJ Stroud so early in his NFL career? They have 3 wide receivers through the first 2 weeks of the season that are averaging 7+ targets a week. You got Nico Collins, Bobby Trees, Robert Woods, and Tank Dell. Now, all offseason, we saw what Tank Dell was capable of, but already starting to see it in week 2 is enough for most guys to go 6 to midnight. And don't even get me started on Nico Collins. This dude right now is really making me look like I know what I'm talking about. The fact that he already has 226 yards receiving through the first 2 weeks of the season has even exceeded my expectations for this guy. Now, Robert Woods, a little bit more of that safety outlet right now, not a lot of big plays. Those days are basically over for Robert Woods, but now they get a matchup going up against Jacksonville, and they allow 27 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Collins has earned that start, but Tank, he's climbing fast. As for Jacksonville, we just need a little bit of luck to start going their way, and we're going to be scoring massive points in fantasy football. There were 4 touchdowns last week that were brought back due to the receivers only getting 1 foot in bounds. I mean, we're talking about inches away from huge fantasy points each and every time. But the scoring chances are there. So really, it's not a huge concern going forward. It was definitely great to see Christian Kirk bounce back. So many people panicked after 1 week and were like, see, Christian Kirk isn't anything anymore. 14 targets, 11 receptions, 110 yards a week later, and all of a sudden everybody loves Christian Kirk once again. Now, if you've been here long enough, that shouldn't be a surprise to you because we've loved Christian Kirk basically since he signed in Jacksonville. Now, Calvin Ridley, yes, a down week in week 2, did miss out on one of those touchdowns, but he's still hovering right around 10 targets a game. Another guy not overly worried about. Where I'm worried is typically Houston is much better to run against than they are to throw against. And as shocking as that may sound, last year in the 2 games against Houston, Trevor Lawrence had a total of 0 passing touchdowns and 3 interceptions against the Houston Texans defense. Let's hope that they find a little bit of that luck that they need here in week 3. But now we'll head down to Miami for the Broncos and the Dolphins, and it was great to have Jerry Jeudy back, right? He didn't look 100%, wasn't quite as quick and crisp as he normally is, but it was great to see him back on the field so fast and playing 68% of the snaps. But with other options on this team like Courtland Sutton and Marvin Mims, Brandon Johnson, who a lot of people didn't even know until week 2, with them out there as available options, I don't see them just going straight full Jeudy chop anytime too soon. Because of that, we have to know that there's going to be big risk until we see the volume return to Jerry Jeudy. Now, there is a silver lining here. They're going up against the Miami Dolphins, and they can score on anyone. That forces opponents to have to throw the ball all 4 quarters. Now, Mims and Johnson, they're going to be a little bit too boom or bust, right? They're dependent on that big play. But I'm really not trying to overhype Courtland Sutton or Jerry Jeudy either. They're all going to be involved to try to keep pace with the Dolphins this week, and that's going to lower their overall ceiling. Now, Sutton and Jeudy, they're going to be Verge top 30 guys for me this week, and we're just hoping some of that volume continues. As for Miami, I think we all know what to do here each and every week. There is no way that you can sit Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle. Now they're going up against Denver, and Denver has allowed 31 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We're hoping for another big day for Hill and Waddle, which will then take us up to Minnesota for the Vikings and the Chargers and our Manscaped matchup of the week. If you still haven't checked out Manscaped.com, what are you even doing with your life? They can absolutely take care of you, fellas, so be sure to head over to Manscaped.com after this video is over, find yourself something for the bathroom, and thank me later. Just be sure to use promo code HEADLINERS for 20% off and free shipping. But in case you can't tell, I'm a little excited for this matchup. It was the same matchup that was my Manscaped matchup to watch for the quarterback position. I contemplate, can I do the same match? Yes, I can do the same matchup because I'm pumped up for it, especially as a Justin Jefferson owner. The Chargers right now, they're allowing 49.1 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is the most in the NFL, but we already know that we start Justin Jefferson. But it's also one of those situations this week where I love Jordan Addison as well. This kid has a nose for the end zone and has been able to score touchdowns now in back-to-back games, the first 2 games of his NFL career. I actually don't hate KJ Osborne either, though. I can totally see him finding the end zone this week, too. The biggest issue we had last week with KJ Osborne was drops. He had 2 of them, and they were very costly. But when you keep hearing me talk about all these receiving options, you're like, dude, there's no way that all these guys can go off in this match. There's no way they're all going to score that many points. I mean, last week, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, KJ Osborne, and TJ Hawkinson all scored over 10 fantasy points in week 2, so it's possible. But I'm almost just as excited for the wide receivers in LA as well. Right now, the Vikings are allowing almost 30 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Keenan Allen has all but silenced the he's old and washed that group from the preseason, because this dude's gone out and got 19 targets, 14 receptions, 187 yards, and 2 damn touchdowns. Go get yourself some. Keenan Allen in just the first 2 weeks of the season, he's the clear number 1 receiving option in LA. Now, Mike Williams isn't far behind him. 18 targets, 12 catches, 128 yards, just no touchdowns. He needs to find the end zone, and honestly, this could be the week that he does it. No other wide receiver on the team has over 6 targets. There's really no timetable just yet for Austin Eckler, which means, yes, more throwing. I have no issues if you're starting Keenan Allen or Mike Williams here in week 3. But now let's talk about the Jets and the New England Patriots here this week. And thank you, Garrett Wilson, for taking a short route the distance and helping save the fantasy days of everyone who was forced to have to start you in week 2. Because if it wasn't for that big play, we would have been royally effed. But I have to think that for the rest of the season, if we don't get consistent big plays, we're going to be disappointed more times than not. He only had 2 catches in week 2, did Garrett Wilson, on 8 targets. Most of them weren't even catchable. Now they get to face off against a Patriots defense that allows 30 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which isn't bad. But we all know that New England tries their best to take away the best player of their opponent. Who is that going to be? Is it Garrett Wilson or is it Breece Hall this week? Either way, we all know that with Zach Wilson under center, Garrett Wilson is going to be a risk and the only wide receiver we even remotely think about in this offense, but it's not safe at all. Now for the Patriots, we have to continue to suffer through like 206 guys catching passes in New England. But what makes it even more difficult, out of the 7 players that caught passes in week 2, no one averaged over 9.5 yards per reception. This passing game in New England is basically like an extension of the running game because they're not going down the field. Now, Kendrick Bourne, he seems to be the number 1 here in New England. He's averaging right around 10 targets per game. I know what I said earlier. We start wide receivers who average 10 targets a game. But really, there's a problem there because he's only caught 50% of the targets he's received, and he's averaging less than 10 yards per reception. So the ceiling is pretty freaking low. Between the split volume, the minimal big plays, and the matchup against this Jets defense, if I had to choose one guy in this offense, it would be Kendrick Bourne, but there is still huge risk. But that'll take us over to Washington for the Commanders and the Bills, and do you smell that? What? Smells like another Gabe Davis touchdown in week 3. Because going against the Commanders, they allow over 34.5 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We all know that Stefon Diggs is a must start each and every week. That's not shocking news to anyone. But this is a good matchup for both of these guys. Really, all Gabe Davis needs is more volume. He's caught 8 of the 11 targets he's received, averaged 15.5 yards per reception, and has 1 touchdown on the season, just like Stefon Diggs. Now, like usual, because of the lower volume, he has a lot more risk associated with him. But the stars are kind of aligning for him to have another decent week, and if you need somebody with some higher upside, that could be Gabe Davis. Now, for Washington, we just need someone to emerge as the top option in this offense. No one on the team is averaging over 6 targets per game. No one on the team is averaging over 42.5 receiving yards per game, and now Sam Howell gets his most difficult matchup of the season, going up against the Buffalo Bills, a Bills team that allows the 6th fewest passing yards per game. This is going to be an uphill battle for this wide receiver duo to really produce much of anything here this week. Between the lower volume, the shorter throws, and the tough matchup, both Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson are going to be, I'm talking about dangerously close to not even making it in my top 30 this week. There's a lot of risk involved with these guys, but it's really going to come down to like a missed defensive assignment or a defender falling down or missing a tackle to have one of these guys break off a big play to make them fantasy viable. Which will then take us over to Seattle for the Seahawks and the Carolina Panthers. And look at old man Thielen having a decent day in week 2. 9 targets, 7 receptions, 54 yards and a touchdown. But this isn't a team in Carolina that's going to get a whole lot of passing touchdowns, so we really can't count on them weekly. I mean, as of right now, Jonathan Mingo is leading this team in targets with 13, but has only caught 5 of them for 43 yards pass, not considering for fantasy football. Now, Seattle has allowed 41 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That's 4th most in the NFL. So really, this isn't a bad matchup whatsoever. Seattle can be had through the air, but none of these guys have an overly high ceiling. Look at what a good game was for Adam Thielen. 54 yards on 7 catches. If he doesn't score the touchdown, we're probably not even talking about him. But I expect Carolina to be trailing in this game and having to throw. Adam Thielen right now seems like the best option. And when you have a matchup like this, I can't ignore everyone. Thielen will be verge top 30 for me here this week with some risk. For Seattle, it was great to see the return of 2022 Geno. Now, because of that return of Geno, both DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett are going to continue to be top 24 options. Now, this isn't going to be the easiest matchup for them, though. Carolina only allows 16 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That's third fewest in the NFL. But they really haven't been tested like they're going to be this week against the Seattle wide receivers. Now, we have JSN and Tyler Lockett still running those underneath routes. Really like that we're starting to see DK Metcalf be a little bit more vertical, right? Last year, he became more of a chain mover. Now we're starting to see him go down the field more often, and we already know that the touchdown upside in this offense, it sits with Tyler Lockett. So between that big play ability of DK Metcalf averaging almost 14 yards per reception, the touchdown upside of Tyler Lockett, I'm really hoping that the 12th man in Seattle can kind of give this offense a little bit of a push, and both these guys can find the end zone in week 3. Which will take us out to the desert, the Arizona Cardinals and Dallas Cowboys, and there's really no need to go too deep on this one. There's only one wide receiver on each team that's even fantasy viable right now. On the Arizona side, it's Hollywood Brown, and by no means is he some must-start guy. He's really not. Now, back-to-back weeks, the Cardinals have started off pretty good in their game and then absolutely faded in the second half. Now, Brown is dang near the definition of touchdown dependent in fantasy football. And now he gets a matchup going up against this Dallas defense. I don't see a whole lot of touchdowns going anywhere near Arizona's direction. This Dallas defense, they only allow 13.5 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That's fewest in the NFL. I have to think that there are better, safer options this week than Hollywood Brown. For Dallas, it's a no-brainer though, right? We always start CeeDee Lamb, and he's off to a pretty hot start. 15 catches, 220 yards, still looking for his first touchdown though through his first 2 games. But now he gets a matchup going up against the Arizona Cardinals, and there is no one on the roster on the defensive side of the football that can stop CeeDee Lamb in Arizona. I expect another big game from him here this week. But now we'll head up to Kansas City for the Chiefs and the Bears, and don't be alarmed by the amount of red on your screen. It's supposed to be there. Now, we all know at this point that the Bears are running some youth football playbook. It's absolutely horrendous in Chicago, but let this sink in. Roschon Johnson has the same amount of targets in this offense that DJ Moore does. Do you want to hear something even more insane? So does Chase Claypool. I don't know what the hell is going on in Chicago, but this coaching staff has gone full stupid on us. Now, DJ Moore has done fine with the volume he has received. He's brought in 8 of his 9 targets. He leads the team in receiving yards with 129, and 6 of his 8 catches have resulted in a first down. But due to this idiotic play calling, Matt Nagy's not back in the building. This is eerily similar to what we dealt with when Matt Nagy was in Chicago. But because of this, DJ Moore is way more risky than he really should be. He's still going to be in my top 30, but a lot lower than he has to start the season. But really, Kansas City has its own set of fantasy problems, right? Once again, Patrick Mahomes went out in week 2 and had 11 different players catch a pass. But no one other than Travis Kelce had more than 5 targets. There was only 1 touchdown that went to a wide receiver, which was Sky Moore. And I'm going to have to keep saying what I've been saying all along. At the end of the game, these wide receivers are going to have a great game with combined numbers. But there are so many people involved in this offense, there is not one guy that you can look at each and every week as being the guy that you want to start. It's all going to depend on who scores the touchdown. Can all of them get touchdowns? No, they can't. I guess we could turn it into a little bit of a game, right? It's kind of impossible to know, but we can guess a wide receiver each week and just see how many we can hit throughout the season. This week, let's say the touchdown goes to, let's say Justin Watson, which will then take us to Sunday Night Football, Pittsburgh Steelers, Las Vegas Raiders. And on one side, we know that we have to start Davante Adams each and every week. He was able to clear the concussion protocol, but we're still waiting to find out about Jacoby Myers, who's still in the concussion protocol. He already missed the week 2 game. We're hoping he can return here in week 3 because they are really going to need him. The pass rush of the Pittsburgh Steelers isn't going to give Jimmy G very much time. He's going to have to get rid of the ball quick. And because of that, I can really see both Davante Adams and Jakobi Meyers, if he's able to go, as being guys that could rack up some receptions in this ball game if you play in PPR scoring. The yardage totals may not be huge. We know that touchdowns are hard to come by in Las Vegas, but definitely racking up some receptions because Jimmy G's having to get rid of the ball so quick. But another thing we're paying attention to is the availability of Minkah Fitzpatrick for the Steelers. If he's not able to play, that is only going to open up things a little bit more. However, until we get news on Jakobi Meyers, right now, it's just Adams. On the Pittsburgh side of things, the only weekly option with Deontay Johnson out of the picture is going to be George Pickens. In his first game this year without Johnson on the field, he was targeted 10 times. Only hauled in 4 of them, though. Luckily, one of them, he took the distance for a huge touchdown. Now he's going to get a matchup going up against the Las Vegas Raiders, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if he finds similar success. He would just be so much safer if he could get more catchable targets. But as the true number 1 right now in Pittsburgh, I have no issues starting George Pickens. Which will then take us to the Monday night doubleheader. Once again, Philadelphia Eagles, Tampa Bay Buccaneers up first, and we should have some fireworks in this game. Both of these defenses have allowed over 31 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Both of them can shut down the running game, and both of them have wide receivers that have started the season off crazy hot. No, it hasn't been A.J. Brown in Philadelphia. It's been Devontae Smith, and it's not like Smith is just getting all the volume and A.J. isn't. They both actually have 11 receptions on the season. Smith is just averaging 7 more yards per reception and has scored 2 touchdowns to AJ's 0. But I'm not overly concerned. AJ Brown has had multiple big plays called back due to penalties, including a touchdown. So like I said, I'm not overly worried. Plus, we saw AJ Brown getting a little heated on the sideline last week. I wouldn't be surprised if they force feed him the ball to start off Monday Night Football in primetime TV. Now, as for Tampa Bay, it's all about the play of Baker Mayfield. Hate him if you want, but he's played pretty well the first 2 weeks of the season. And I don't think anybody expected the connection between him and Mike Evans to be what it has been the first 2 weeks of the season. Through those first 2 games, Mike Evans is averaging 118 yards per game, has 2 touchdowns, averaging 21 fantasy points per game, and is the wide receiver 2 overall in fantasy football. Now, Chris Godwin hasn't looked bad. He only has 2 receptions less than Mike Evans. The problem is they're all short little dump-off passes. Evans is averaging almost 10 yards per reception more than Chris Godwin. I won't be shocked if Baker Mayfield tries to go out there and put on a show in Monday Night Football. If I feel more confident about anybody, though, it's still Mike Evans. And then the last game of the week is going to be the Cincinnati Bengals, Los Angeles Rams, and this is a matchup that has a couple storylines to follow. The first one being the health and availability of Joe Burrow, who re-aggravated his calf strain in week 2. There's rumors swirling around of him missing some time. Now, obviously, if we don't have Joe Burrow, that is going to drastically limit the upside of Ja'Marr Chase and T. Higgins, because I would bet that most people outside of Cincinnati don't even know who the quarterback 2 is on the Cincinnati depth chart. Do you know? It's Jake Browning. Everyone just went, who the hell is that? But I know, as of right now, it is super hard to sit Ja'Marr Chase or T. Higgins. This is definitely a situation we're going to have to pay close attention to as we head into the weekend, because there's a lot of risks surrounding both of these guys. Now, when we talk about Los Angeles, they have a wide receiver that, honestly, I may start over both Chase and Higgins this week. It's freaking Pikachu, aka Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. We talked about this guy during the offseason and how he could develop a role, but I don't think anyone expected this type of start from this guy. 35 targets, 25 receptions, and 266 yards in just 2 games. He has basically adopted the Cooper Kupp role in this offense, and his volume is absolutely through the roof. Now, can this continue all year long? Highly doubtful. But I don't think we can ignore Tutu Atwell either. He's got 13 catches for 196 yards and is averaging 15 yards per reception. Now, the Bengals are allowing 23 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and we know the biggest issue with this Rams offense is just trying to find touchdowns. But the receptions and the yards are there for the taking once again this week, and I would not be surprised to see either one of these guys rack them up once again. All right, there you have it. We've gone through every matchup now for week 3. Hopefully I was able to give you a little bit of information to make your decisions a little bit easier. Don't forget though, Thursday's right around the corner, and that's when our rankings drop. So if you're really trying to determine between a few different guys, that video will be able to help you out as well. I'm gonna go ahead and get out of here for the day though. Hopefully you have a great rest of your day, and then do your part to make the world a better place.